Night falls softly over the desert's edge, where the ancient sands whisper secrets long forgotten. Southeast of modern-day Baghdad, time seems to hold its breath. Here, nestled beneath layers of earth and history, lie the silent ruins of a bygone civilization, Parthian dwellings, tombs, temples, and artifacts buried in stillness. In the early 1930s, a team of archaeologists began a routine excavation, unaware that this quiet dig would unearth a mystery that continues to hum gently through time. The air that day was dry and warm. Before the sun reached its zenith, a German team was carefully excavating an ancient grave. Among the usual remnants of pottery and stone, they found an unremarkable clay jerabout, 6 inches tall, faded yellow-gray, slightly cracked, yet whole enough to be catalogued. At first, it was treated like any other artifact, dusted off, recorded, and gently shelved among thousands of other ancient remnants. But fate had a different plan for this little jar. Years later, deep in the storage rooms of the National Museum of Iraq, a curator rediscovered the jar. As it was cleaned, something curious caught the eye. Peeking through a break in the clay was more than just earth and time. Inside lay a tightly rolled copper cylinder, and within it, an iron rod. The opening of the jar had remnants of a black substance, bitumen, likely used to seal it. This combination, clay, metal, a sealed container, sparked intrigue. In 1938, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König took a special interest in the object. At the time, he served as the museum's director and had a deep fascination with Mesopotamian and Parthian artifacts. When he held the jar in his hands, something about it stirred a curious recognition. A copper tube hugged the inside of the jar. An iron rod protruded from its center. The bitumen at the top seemed to insulate the two metals from touching. It reminded him not of ancient ritual, but of chemistry, specifically electrochemistry. A battery from the Parthian Empire over 2,000 years ago? The idea shimmered faintly, like a star barely visible at twilight. And suddenly, the jar was no longer just a jar. It became a question, a spark, a quiet echo from the past. But König's hypothesis didn't solve the mystery, it only deepened it. If this was truly an ancient battery, what was it for? Practical use? Sacred ritual? Why was there no mention of it in ancient texts? Why had no other examples surfaced in nearby regions or cultures? People began to call it the Baghdad Battery, though even today we cannot say with certainty whether it truly functioned as one. It stands at the intersection of wonder and skepticism, a symbol of the fine line between imagination and evidence. Like a seed buried in the deep soil of time, this little artifact began to grow roots in the minds of scientists, dreamers, and storytellers alike. And tonight, under the soft veil of darkness, we'll gently follow those roots backward into the mystery. Let us begin where it all began. Let the silence of the sands give way, and listen closely. The ruins that cradled the Baghdad Battery were more than simple remnants of stone and clay. They were the skeletal remains of a once vibrant world. Nestled along the meandering path of the Tigris River, near modern-day Kujut Rabua, just outside of Baghdad, the site was one of many that dotted the region, each hiding fragments of the Parthian past beneath the desert's calm exterior. It was the 1930s, and the world stood on the brink of transformation. While political tensions stirred across continents, in Iraq, quiet revolutions of knowledge were unfolding in the dust. Archaeologists, mostly European, had turned their attention to Mesopotamia, drawn by its promise of secrets layered deep in time. Among those secrets lay a site of particular obscurity, an unassuming Parthian village, largely forgotten even by local memory. This place bore no grand ziggurats like Ur or Babylon, no vast palaces or monumental inscriptions. Its significance, in many ways, was precisely in its silence. It was a place that had not been overwritten by the ambitions of kings or priests. And yet, from this very ground, the strange artifact we now call the Baghdad Battery emerged. The village itself would have been humble. Parthian houses were often made of mud brick with flat roofs and inner courtyards. They offered shade from the desert heat and were simple in their geometry. Life would have moved slowly, families grinding grain, children fetching water from a nearby canal, priests tending to altars. Overhead, the same sun we know today would have cast golden light through the heat haze, illuminating lives both ordinary and mysterious. In this environment, technology and tradition were never far apart. The Parthians were known for their skills in metalwork, their rich trade routes, and their complex fusion of Greek, Persian, and local Mesopotamian influences. Yet very little of their technological legacy survived in written form. Most of what we know comes from ruins, from the fragments they left behind: coins, tools, weapons, and the occasional anomaly. And that jar, sealed so tightly, containing metals that should not have been stored together, why did it exist? As archaeologists uncovered more graves and structures, they found other similar vessels, though few with the exact same internal configuration. Some held ashes or oils, others contained small figurines. But the few that resembled the supposed battery were rare, and each seemed slightly different, as though no standard template had ever existed. This inconsistency only deepened the mystery. Were these vessels ceremonial? Perhaps funerary? Did they contain ingredients for some alchemical practice? Or were they part of an unknown daily ritual, lost to the winds of time? What made the Baghdad Battery so intriguing was not simply its components, but its context, or rather, the lack of one. It wasn't found within a laboratory or workshop. It wasn't described in a scroll or painted onto temple walls. It was found buried near other ordinary objects, quietly waiting in the sand. And the ruins themselves, long crumbled, offered no inscriptions or instructions, no hints as to the vessel's intended purpose, only cracked stone, faded walls, and silence. Yet sometimes silence speaks. It speaks in the alignment of stones, the wear of tools, the thickness of soot on an oven wall. It murmurs through the irregularities of pottery, the wear on a copper tube, the oxidization of iron within an earthen jar. These are the languages of archaeology, patient, tentative, always half-guessing. As night deepens and the winds across the desert grow cooler, we sit with this silence. We imagine a village now gone, its fires extinguished, its footsteps faded. And in one forgotten room, a clay jar sits on a shelf, not glowing, not humming, just waiting. Waiting to be remembered. The artifact might have slipped quietly into obscurity, another puzzle piece lost in the layers of time, if not for one man's quiet curiosity. Wilhelm König was not a man prone to dramatic claims. In his role as director of the Baghdad Antiquities Museum during the late 1930s, he was known for his measured approach, his long hours bent over catalogs, and his quiet fascination with the smallest details of ancient life. Yet it was precisely this careful nature that made him pause when he encountered the strange clay vessel. The object sat among dozens of other storage items retrieved from the excavation site near Kujut Rabua. At first glance, it seemed like little more than another funerary Jarkaman place and unremarkable. But König's trained eye noticed the anomaly, the strange layering of materials: copper, iron, bitumen. Why would such an assembly be sealed in a clay jar? He gently examined the piece, holding it beneath the filtered light of his office. The copper cylinder was suspended inside the jar, encasing a central iron rod. Bitumen had been used to seal the top, separating the two metals. And as he tilted the jar, he could almost imagine a liquid once sloshing inside, something conductive. The configuration reminded him, though, cautiously, of an electrochemical cell. He didn't say it aloud at first. Such an idea was too strange, too fantastical. Electricity in antiquity? It felt like science fiction. And yet, the structure fit the theory so well. A simple battery, long before the world even had a word for it. But König wasn't a physicist. He needed more than intuition. He began to consult with chemists and engineers, posing the configuration as a hypothetical. If I had a clay jar containing a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and some acidic solution, could it generate a current? The answer was yes. Unequivocally, yes. In theory, such a device could produce between 0.5 and 1 volt of electricity, modest by modern standards, but undeniably functional. If one were to link several of these in series, it could power small electrical effects, like electroplating gold onto a surface. The implications were extraordinary. König began writing his observations. He noted the technical possibilities, but also the historical caution such a claim required. His paper, published in 1940, laid out a bold yet softly worded hypothesis. The Parthians, or perhaps even earlier cultures, may have discovered a rudimentary form of electricity, perhaps not fully understood, but functional nonetheless. Predictably, the academic world met his theory with raised eyebrows and narrowed gazes. Some scholars dismissed it outright. Others countered that the jar was likely used for storing sacred scrolls or ritualistic incense. The metallic parts could have served symbolic purposes. The bitumen? Merely a sealant, common in many ceremonial vessels. Yet König never insisted beyond the evidence. He offered his theory not as fact, but as possibility inviting exploration, not certainty. And in this, his legacy endured. Because while many disagreed with König, few could ignore the gentle riddle he had posed. The jar existed. Its materials were real. Its construction was deliberate. Whether intended as a battery or not, it forced scholars to consider what else ancient peoples might have understood, what technologies might have risen and fallen, undocumented, like soft sparks in the long dark of history. König died in the decades that followed, his theory never proven, never fully refuted. Yet even today, his name is quietly invoked wherever the Baghdad Battery is mentioned. a man who looked at a simple vessel and dared to ask a strange question. And sometimes history turns not on grand wars or epic speeches, but on small, quiet questions whispered across time. Tonight, in the hush between waking and dreaming, we remember the man who held a clay jar in his hands and listened patiently for what it might be trying to say. The mystery deepens, not in the realm of grand discoveries, but in the humble clay of a small vessel. To understand why the Baghdad Battery evokes such wonder, we must look closer gently, careful at what it is made of. The vessel itself is unassuming. Standing just over 5 inches tall, made of a coarse yellowish clay, it resembles countless other storage jars from antiquity. Its shape is simple: a bulbous body, a narrow neck, and a lip at the top where something once sealed it shut. It would not draw attention on its own, but inside, things become more curious. Resting snugly within the jar is a thin copper cylinder, about an inch in diameter. It was carefully rolled from a copper sheet, its edges pressed together, not fused, but held in shape by pressure and design. This cylinder is suspended within the jar, and down through its center runs an iron rod. The rod does not touch the copper. Instead, it is held in place by a black, tar-like substance bitumen applied around the mouth of the jar. The bitumen serves several purposes. It insulates the iron from the copper. It seals the top of the jar, preventing liquid from evaporating or leaking. And perhaps most telling of Allet is applied deliberately, not haphazardly. Someone long ago meant for this object to be sealed tight. If an acidic liquid had once filled the jar, such as vinegar, lemon juice, or fermented weinite, would create the necessary conditions for a simple voltaic cell. The copper would act as the cathode, the iron as the anode, and the liquid as the electrolyte. When connected by a conductor, a small electric current could flow. No sparks, no visible light. Just a whisper of electricity, enough to tingle a fingertip or gild the surface of silver with a faint sheen of gold. Some modern researchers have recreated this configuration. In laboratory settings, replicas of the Baghdad Battery have produced between 0.5 and 1.1 volts. Not much, but enough. Enough to prove that, at least in theory, the device works. But this only invites more questions. Was the resemblance intentional or a coincidence? Could the copper and iron serve another purpose? And if it were truly a battery, why have we found only a few like it? Those who support the battery theory suggest it was used for electroplating coating objects in gold or silver through electrochemical means. Others believe it might have been used in medicine or ritualatool to induce tingling sensations or stimulate the body as part of some ancient therapeutic practice. Skeptics, however, argue for a different interpretation. Perhaps the vessel had religious significance. Perhaps the copper and iron were symbolic, the bitumen merely a preservative. After all, the absence of accompanying wires or terminals complicates the electrical theory, and without written records, everything remains speculation. Still, the craftsmanship hints at purpose. Someone, centuries before our modern understanding of chemistry, took the time to layer these materials just so, to shape the copper, to center the rod, to seal it with care. Whether for science, faith, or something between the two, the intention behind the artifact speaks across time. Even in silence, clay speaks. Its surface holds the memory of hands that shaped it. The ridges and imperfections tell of fingers that once pressed and smoothed. The copper bears the faint lines of being rolled. The iron shows traces of corrosion, perhaps from acid, perhaps from time. All of it like a slow breath exhaled from the past, waiting for someone to listen. And tonight, we do just that. We do not rush to judgment. We do not demand answers. We simply look closely, gently, and wonder, what were they trying to make? And why does this quiet little object still glow if only in our imagination? There is a place quiet and ancient where science and the sacred once walked side by side. In the world of the Parthians and those before them, knowledge was not kept in laboratories but in temples. Curiosity was not only the domain of philosophers, but of priests. And technology, if it existed, often wore the veil of ritual. So, we ask, if the Baghdad Battery truly could produce electricity, what did its makers believe they were doing? In modern thought, electricity is a matter of physics, a quantifiable flow of electrons, measured and predictable. But in the ancient world, unseen forces were often folded into myth and ceremony. Light, heat, magnetisms, these were not explained through formulas, but through divine presence. A shock from an electric fish was not a biological phenomenon, but the touch of a spirit. A spark from amber rubbed with cloth was not friction, but perhaps the breath of a god. So imagine, in a dim room, lit only by oil lamps, a priest dips a metal rod into a small jar. A tingling sensation dances up his arm. A coin darkens, then brightens again under his touch. To him, this might not be science, it might be prayer answered. In many cultures of the ancient Near East, rituals were deeply sensory. Smell, color, taste, tushal played a role in summoning or appeasing the divine. An object that could produce an invisible effect, like a tingling shock or a surface transformation, would have held immense power. It might have been used sparingly during initiations or sacred performances. Perhaps the effect was demonstrated to a chosen few, cloaked in language of mystery and reverence, and the materials themselves, copper, iron, clay, and bitumen, were not neutral. Each had symbolic weight. Copper was associated with Venus and femininity. Iron with war, Mars, and masculine force. Clay was the stuff of creation itself, the earth from which humans were shaped. Bitumen, dark and fragrant, often sealed tombs and temple jars, keeping the sacred in and the profane out. In this context, the vessel becomes more than a battery. It becomes an object of transformation. It may not matter whether its builders understood electron flow. What may matter is that they experienced change. Metal becoming gold, stillness becoming sensation, liquid becoming light. These were sacred acts, even if they occurred without a full scientific framework. There are echoes of this idea in other traditions. In ancient Egypt, priests used magnetic stones in healing rituals. In Greece, Heron of Alexandria built automata-moving statues and temple doors powered by steam pressure used in worship. Even further east, Chinese alchemists experimented with substances that hissed, sparked, or glowed in search of immortality. Perhaps, in Mesopotamia, there were similar experimenters, not scientists in the modern sense, but temple artisans, spiritual technicians. people who worked at the threshold of the visible and invisible. This way of thinking helps us understand how technology could exist and yet not be written about. If the Baghdad Battery was used in temples, it might have been protected knowledge revealed only to the initiated. Its use might have been wrapped in ceremony and myth, passed down not through scrolls, but through ritual. And so, as we sit here, centuries later, we are not only asking what it did, but what it meant. To those who touched it, who built it, who sealed it with their own hands, was it a tool, or was it a bridge toe, something unseen? In the hush of night, these questions feel less like puzzles to solve and more like quiet invitations to wonder, to imagine, to step gently into the minds of those who saw power not as volts and wires, but as sacred breath flowing through the world. In 1940, just as the world was unraveling into war, Wilhelm König published a short but quietly provocative paper. Within its measured lines and carefully worded analysis, he laid out a theory that would ripple gently through the world of archaeology for decades to come. The object found near Baghdad clay vessel, copper cylinder, iron rod, and bitumen seal might, in fact, be a type of ancient battery. The paper, published in German, did not make headlines. It was not received with celebration nor scandal, but with a kind of academic discomfort. König, after all, was not proposing the discovery of a forgotten temple or a lost language. He was suggesting that ancient people, in a time and place not associated with advanced science, may have stumbled upon a form of electricity. For many scholars, this felt like a step too far. Still, König was cautious in his tone. He did not make grand declarations. Instead, he raised thoughtful questions. Could the vessel's construction generate a mild electric charge? Might similar devices have been used to produce effects like electroplating? Could the knowledge have been confined to temples or workshops, long since vanished from the historical record? He outlined the electrochemical reasoning carefully. The iron rod, he explained, would act as a positive terminal and the copper as the negative. An acidic solution, such as vinegar or wine, would serve as the electrolyte. When sealed and properly prepared, the device could, in theory, produce a small but measurable current. It wasn't fantasy, it was science. Quiet, plausible, and strangely poetic. Yet the reaction from the scholarly world was mixed. Some responded with curiosity, reproducing the device and confirming that yes, it could indeed function as a primitive battery. Simple experiments showed it capable of producing enough voltage to create electroplating effects. Small sheets of metal, dipped into solutions and exposed to the current, developed delicate coatings gold leaf over silver, for example. In this context, König's theory gained traction in the scientific community, if not among the more conservative historians. But others remained unconvinced. Critics pointed to the lack of contextual evidence. There were no tools, no wires, no descriptions in the texts of the time. If such devices were truly used for electroplating, where were the workshops? The manuals? The other jars? Some suggested alternative interpretations. Perhaps the copper and iron components were coincidental. Maybe the vessels were used to store sacred scrolls, with the metal serving a ritual or protective function. The bitumen could have been nothing more than a simple sealant to keep out moisture, not part of a chemical process. König, for his part, did not argue. He continued his work quietly, letting the idea settle where it would. He understood that history is not easily persuaded, especially when it is asked to rewrite its assumptions. Still, his theory endured not as a proven fact, but as a door left ajar. In the years that followed, journalists, science enthusiasts, and even television programs picked up the idea. The Baghdad Battery began to appear in articles and documentaries, often surrounded by a haze of speculation. Was this proof of ancient knowledge lost to time? Could this mean ancient people knew more than we think? Was electricity known centuries before Galvani and Volta? For König, the answer was simpler. His proposal had never been about rewriting history with bold strokes. It was about possibility, about listening to an artifact that didn't quite fit, and asking gently, what if? Even now, in the quiet hum of night, that question remains. And maybe that is the real power of the Baghdad Battery, not the voltage it may or may not have generated, but the soft, persistent current of wonder it still carries. The reminder that history, like electricity, often moves invisibly, and that sometimes the smallest vessels carry the brightest sparks. There's something beautifully human about trying to recreate the past. When faced with a mystery, we reach for our tools, not only of logic and science, but of imagination. And so, in the decades following Wilhelm König's theory, others took up the quiet challenge to reconstruct the Baghdad Battery, to hold it again, not just in thought, but in hand. The first reproductions began modestly. Tinkering in laboratories and home workshops, researchers and amateur historians recreated the vessel using clay jars, copper tubing, and iron rods, closely following the dimensions König had described. They filled their replicas with acidic liquids, vinegar, lemon juice, grape juice, all readily available, all plausible for an ancient society. Then came the moment of truth. Wires were attached. A small meter waited, its needle still. And then, the quiet Miraclia flicker, a jump, voltage. Sometimes 0.5 volts, sometimes as high as 1.1. Not a storm, but a spark, a whisper of energy humming softly from clay and metal. It worked. Or at least, it could work. The physical design was sound. With the right materials, the right sealing, and the right liquid, the Baghdad Battery could produce electricity. No tricks. No wishful thinking. Just simple, ancient chemistry discovered. Encouraged by this, some researchers took things further. They connected multiple units in a series, like modern batteries chained together. The result? Greater voltage. Enough to cause a faint tingle when touched. Enough even to perform electroplating. In controlled experiments, replicas of the Baghdad Battery were used to plate thin layers of silver onto copper coins, confirming that such a device, primitive as it seemed, could serve a practical purpose. Gold leaf, too, could be bonded to surfaces with enough current. And suddenly, the idea that ancient artisans might have used such tools no longer seemed impossible. Still, many questions lingered. For one, no wires or connectors were ever found alongside the original artifacts. This doesn't mean they never existed. Copper wires corrode, organic materials decay, but it does mean we can't be certain. No direct inscriptions mention a process like electroplating, nor any instructions for building such a device. Yet even with these limitations, reconstructions revealed something profound. that ancient people could have discovered electricity not by seeking it, but by observing, experimenting, and crafting. It's entirely possible they didn't understand electricity as we do today, yet still harnessed its effects just as people once harnessed fire without knowing what combustion meant. It is not uncommon in history for people to use a phenomenon before they understand its principles. The Chinese used gunpowder centuries before atomic theory. Sailors navigated by stars long before the laws of celestial motion were written. So why not electricity in some humble, practical form? And if they did create these batteries, whether for gilding, healing, or ritual, how did the knowledge disappear? That too has precedent. Countless discoveries have flickered and vanished. Greek steam engines, Roman concrete, Damascus steel, Mayan astronomy. In the long ebb and flow of civilizations, ideas are often lost, not because they failed, but because their keepers fell silent. The Baghdad Battery may be one such silence. Its reconstructions today are not only scientific exercises, but acts of empathy, of reaching backward through time, with gentle hands and open minds, and trying to feel what someone 2,000 years ago might have felt, the thrill of something new, the surprise of lightness in the fingers, the spark of transformation. And here, in our quiet rooms, we recreate not just an object, but a moment when clay and copper and iron, joined with care, whispered something unseen into the world. A moment that may have passed like a dream, but still lingers softly in our imagining. For every mystery that invites wonder, there will always be voices that urge caution. And when it comes to the Baghdad Battery, skepticism is not only natural, it is necessary. After all, archaeology is a discipline rooted in what can be seen, measured, and verified. Dreams are lovely, but the earth demands evidence. And so, in the decades following König's proposal, scholars began to weigh the possibility that the jar was a battery against the equally plausible idea that it wasn't. One of the most compelling arguments from skeptics centers on the lack of it. The vessel was not found with wires, terminals, or tools that might support an electrical function. It came from a tomb or grave-like setting where many such vessels had been uncovered. That, to many, suggests a ritual or symbolic purpose. In these settings, it was not unusual to find jars sealed with bitumen. Some held sacred scrolls, others perfumes or oils used in burial rites. Metal components might serve structural purposes or hold symbolic value. A copper cylinder might contain a rolled prayer or offering. An iron rod might be nothing more than a closure pin. Without explicit inscriptions or detailed illustrations, it becomes difficult to distinguish a scientific object from a ceremonial one. This uncertainty fuels the strongest counter-argument: coincidence. Could it be that the battery-like structure was never meant to produce electricity at all? That its materials, though capable of generating a current under the right conditions, were assembled for completely different reasons? That modern scientists, familiar with batteries, simply saw what they wanted to see? To this, defenders of König's theory often reply, it's possible. But then they ask, with equal calm, isn't it also possible the opposite is true? This debate, battery or coincidence, has persisted quietly for decades, drifting in and out of the academic spotlight. Neither side has enough evidence to close the case. And perhaps that's what makes the Baghdad Battery so captivating. It is neither confirmed nor disproven. It exists in a space that is rare in science, the space of maybe. In that maybe, something delicate happens. We begin to see how easily modern minds can project their understanding onto the past. When we see a device that resembles a battery, our minds leap to what we know. But the Parthians may not have thought in terms of voltage or current. If they used this vessel in a ritual, and it tingled upon touch or caused a subtle transformation of metals, they might have viewed it as divine, not technological. And here lies the heart of the mystery. Is it a battery, or is it something else entirely? Even among those who believe in the electrochemical function of the artifact, few claim that the Parthians truly understood electricity in the way 18th or 19th century scientists did. The suggestion is subtler, that they may have discovered a useful effect accidentally or deliberately and used it in a limited, perhaps even sacred context. But without documentation, how do we know? We don't. What we do have is the object itself. The clay jar, the copper cylinder, the iron rod, the careful seal. We have the physical evidence that, in theory, such an assembly can produce a current. And we have the mystery of why someone built it that way, sealed it so thoroughly, and left it in a place so quiet. It could be technology, it could be ritual, it could be both. And perhaps, as night deepens and we listen closely, we come to understand that the boundary between these things is not always so clear. That what we call coincidence may, in some forgotten room, have been intention. Sometimes the line between science and ceremony is drawn not in chalk or ink, but in silence. And that silence still speaks. In the golden flicker of temple light, where sacred chants filled the air and incense curled in slow, fragrant spirals, it is not hard to imagine a priest bending over a curious vessel, his hands steady, his eyes half closed in reverence. He touches metal to metal, perhaps not knowing the word for electricity, but feeling its tingle nonetheless. Among the most intriguing theories surrounding the Baghdad Battery is its possible connection to the practice of electroplating, the art of coating one metal with a thin layer of another, using chemical or electrical means. In this theory, the device may have been used not for lighting lamps or powering machines, but for something quieter, subtler, and no less impressive, decorating precious objects with a delicate skin of gold. Ancient Mesopotamian societies prized gilded items, amulets, figurines, religious artifacts, and while most gilding was done using mechanical methods like hammering thin gold foil over a surface, some scholars and researchers have speculated that an electrical method, however primitive, could have been used for especially fine or sacred items. In controlled experiments, modern researchers have linked multiple reconstructed Baghdad batteries together, filled them with grape juice or vinegar, and successfully plated thin layers of gold onto silver and copper coins. It works. The current is gentle, the result subtle but real. Could this be what the original makers intended? Some point to Mesopotamian temple traditions to support the idea. The temples of the ancient world were not just places of worship. They were centers of craft, science, and administration. Priests were often skilled artisans and keepers of specialized knowledge. They oversaw the production of textiles, metallurgy, perfumes, and yes, jewelry. It's possible, then, that a small class of temple specialists held knowledge of a technique passed down through generations, not necessarily as science, but as ritual. They may have believed the transformation of one metal into another was alchemical, even divine. The gentle shimmer of gold appearing on silver might have been seen not as chemical reaction, but as spiritual manifestation. But here, too, the evidence is elusive. No surviving texts from the period describe electroplating or reference tools that match the Baghdad Battery's design. There are depictions of priests handling sacred vessels and ornaments, but no diagrams, no technical instructions, and yet the objects themselves remain. Ornate jewelry with impossibly thin, smooth gold coatings, techniques that even today are difficult to replicate with ancient tools. Could these objects have been gilded with electrical assistance? There is also the curious presence of temples dedicated to craftsmanship itself, shrines where the gods of metallurgy and creation were honored. In such places, might the line between faith and function have blurred? One speculative theory suggests that the electrical properties of the device may have been secondary to its symbolism. The metals chosen copper and iron might represent opposing forces: earth and sky, life and death, male and female, or other dualities central to religious belief. The sealed jar, then, becomes more than a toolet, becomes a container of balance, a physical expression of unity between opposites. And if the device produced a subtle sensational warmth, a faint pulsate might have been experienced as divine touch. Imagine a ceremony where a devotee places a finger on a consecrated object and feels something unexplainable. No wires, no sparks, just a soft, tingling mystery. Whether these jars were used to plate gold or to manifest awe, their design points to a kind of intentionality that transcends mere storage. They were made carefully, assembled with precision, sealed completely. That suggests purpose, whatever that purpose may have been. Tonight, as we listen to the quiet hum of ancient hands and ancient minds, we return to the temple not as scientists or skeptics, but as guests. We sit in the shadows. We watch the ritual unfold. We feel the current move not only through wires and ions, but through time and imagination. And perhaps, just for a moment, we understand that the mystery was never just in the metal, but in the meaning. In the great mosaic of ancient civilizations, echoes travel farther than we expect. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, Persia to Greece, ideas drift like pollen, subtle, silent, and sometimes invisible, until they take root in the most unexpected places. And in the story of the Baghdad Battery, some of the most haunting echoes come from the hands of a Greek inventor, Heron of Alexandria. Heron lived around the 1st century A.D., some centuries after the time traditionally assigned to the Baghdad Battery. Yet his inventions feel startlingly modern. He crafted mechanical doors that opened automatically, fountains that operated on pressure, even a primitive steam engine known as the Aeolipolia, small rotating device powered by heated water vapor. To the ancient world, Heron's creations were wondrous novelties used in temples, not factories. His steam engine was never used for labor, but perhaps to awe temple visitors as a statue moved or a door creaked open by divine will. And while Heron documented his devices in writing, many scholars believe his knowledge was not his alone, but inherited from earlier traditions that may have extended into the East. This is where the connection becomes tantalizing. Heron understood pressure, valves, pneumatics. He knew how to channel natural forces into motion and effect. Could it be that similar knowledge of forces unseen, such as static or galvanic electricity, was explored by other cultures in parallel or even earlier? The Parthian Empire, after all, was not isolated. It stood at a crossroads of worlds, connected by trade to Rome, influenced by Persia, and shaped by the lingering presence of Alexander's Hellenistic conquests. Greek artisans and scholars lived and worked in Mesopotamia. Ideas traveled along with spices and silks. Could it be that the concept behind the Baghdad Battery, whether discovered independently or shared, was part of this rich cultural exchange? Heron never wrote about electricity, but he did understand cause and effect. He understood that hidden energy could produce visible wonder. In that spirit, the Baghdad Battery fits an object that, like Heron's devices, may have existed on the threshold between practical function and spiritual theater. Other parallels emerge too. The ancient Greeks were fascinated by amberous substance that, when rubbed, attracted bits of straw and cloth. They did not know they were generating static electricity, but they observed the effect. The Greek word for amber, electron, would eventually lend its name to the very science of electricity. This quiet curiosity about unseen energy had already begun. And if we imagine artisans or priests along the Tigris, handling copper, iron, and wine stumbling upon a slight spark, a faint tingle, we can just as easily imagine them doing what humans always do when something strange happens. Trying it again, recording it not in ink, but in gesture, in ritual. Could knowledge of electrochemical reactions have traveled westward, like so many other Mesopotamian ideas? Could it have lingered in temple lore, passed hand to hand across centuries, only to blossom anew in Alexandria's curious machines? Or perhaps the current moved the other way. Perhaps Heron's innovations inspired Eastern thinkers to look deeper at the materials around them. Perhaps what we now call the Baghdad Battery was part of a shared curiosity, part of the great human rhythm. Observe, experiment, refine, forget, rediscover. Either way, what connects these civilizations is not just a specific technology, but a way of thinking, of engaging the world with wonder, of crafting tools not only for utility, but for mystery. A door that opens by itself, a coin that turns gold, a jar that tingles to the touch. These are not just inventions. They are stories, invitations, questions. And tonight, as we let our breath slow and our thoughts drift, we find comfort in the idea that across time, across empires, across oceans of silence, we have always asked the same things. What happens if I try this? What if I combine this with that? And what if, in doing so, I find something no one else has seen? The past hums softly with these questions. We have only to listen. There's something quietly tragic about a forgotten invention. Not the kind that fails, but the kind that works and then disappears. The kind that flickers into the world, illuminates a small corner, and is then tucked away, unrecorded, unremembered. If the Baghdad Battery truly functioned as an electrochemical device, then it might be one of the most poignant examples of such a loss, a working technology unnoticed by the march of history. We often think of progress as a straight linear, steady climb from ignorance to knowledge, from darkness to light. But the truth is far more delicate. History meanders, it stumbles, it forgets. Ideas are not always passed down like heirlooms. Sometimes they are misplaced like stones in the riverbed, shaped by time until their original form is no longer visible. So how could something as extraordinary as the Baghdad Battery be overlooked? One reason may lie in scale. The device, as reconstructed, produces only a tiny current barely enough to feel, not enough to power anything like the tools we associate with electricity. It doesn't light a lamp, doesn't turn a wheel. In a world of torches and oil, such a mild sensation might have seemed like little more than a curiosity interesting, but not transformational. Another reason may be context. If the knowledge was held within temples, passed down through priestly lines, it may have never entered the broader culture. And when empires fell, temples were often looted, burned, or abandoned. The knowledge stored within, especially knowledge not written down, could vanish in a generation. There is also the matter of understanding. Even if the effect was noticed, it may not have been explained. A craftsman might learn that mixing metals and liquids produces an odd result, but without a theory of atoms or electrons, the phenomenon remains magical rather than scientific. And magic, for all its wonder, is rarely documented in technical terms. Consider, too, how much of ancient knowledge was carried in the hands of artisans rather than the pens of scholars. In many civilizations, the literate elite did not perform manual work. The practical knowledge of metalworkers, die makers, and potters was respected but seldom written down. Their discoveries lived in gestures, passed from teacher to apprentice. When those lines broke, the knowledge broke with them. And then there are the silences, imposed by war and conquest. The Parthian Empire, like many before and after, eventually fell to Rome, to Persia, to time. Libraries were destroyed, languages changed. Sacred objects were melted for coin or lost to looters. A small clay jar, misunderstood or deemed unremarkable, might have been tossed aside or buried in a forgotten grave. Generations later, no one would remember what it could do. It is not a failure of the objected, it is a failure of memory. But perhaps it is also a reminder that technology is not only about machines and power, it is also about context, about culture, about curiosity. An invention lives not just in its materials, but in the minds that use it and in the stories they tell about it. The Baghdad Battery may have been a spark that flickered in the shadows of a temple, touched a priest's hand, gilded a sacred statue, and then quietly went out. But its brief glow still warms us, thousands of years later, because it tells us that wonder is not bound by time. That even in an age without circuits or formulas, someone, somewhere, saw a strange result and wondered. Tonight, we hold that wonder gently, and we ask ourselves, how many other sparks were lost? How many silent inventions sleep beneath the sands, waiting to be seen not with certainty, but with care? Not every tool leaves a trail, but every mystery leaves an invitation. Once, the Baghdad Battery sat buried beneath the soil, its copper and iron slumbering under centuries of dust. It was silent then, but today, It has found a different kind of life, not in temples or workshops, but in stories, in books, in films, in games, and online whispers that drift through the digital night. It has become something more than an artifact. It has become legend. The first popular wave of fascination arrived in the late 20th century as media outlets began to explore ancient mysteries in a more sensational light. Documentaries with moody narration and eerie soundtracks began to speak of ancient electricity and lost sciences. The Baghdad Battery featured prominent presented as a tantalizing clue that perhaps ancient civilizations were far before Baghdad, more advanced than we had ever imagined. It wasn't long before the battery made its way into speculative books and articles. Writers who explored ancient astronaut theories or hidden histories seized upon it, weaving it into stories that stretched well beyond the boundaries of academic caution. Was it evidence of alien contact? Proof that humanity once reached heights of knowledge only to fall into a dark age? A forgotten remnant of Atlantis or Lemuria? The theories were dramatic, sometimes far-fetched, but always powered by the same core feeling: wonder. In video games, the battery has appeared as a mysterious relic that unlocks hidden doors or powers ancient machines. In novels, it might serve as the key to an ancient conspiracy, lost technology capable of altering history. On forums and message boards, it is discussed alongside the pyramids, the Antikythera mechanism, and other symbols of ancient genius. In these new settings, the Baghdad Battery takes on symbolic meaning. It is no longer just an artifact. It is a question made solid. A quiet voice from the past asking, "What did we forget?" Even museums, aware of the public's fascination, have embraced the mystery. Replicas of the battery are displayed not just for their archaeological value, but for their power to stir the imagination. Accompanying placards often suggest multiple theories, inviting visitors to consider both scientific and speculative interpretations. The battery becomes a bridge between knowledge and curiosity, between fact and folklore. Yet through all this, the artifact itself remains unchanged, small, simple, fragile. It does not glow or buzz. It offers no clear answers. And maybe that's why it captivates us. In a world that often moves too quickly, where answers are only a click away, the Baghdad Battery reminds us that some things cannot be Googled into clarity. Some truths lie in the realm of wonder, in the pause before certainty, in the night's quiet space between dreaming and waking. Its rise in popular culture shows us something deeply human, our need for mystery. We want to believe that the past holds secrets, that history is not a closed book, but a living story still unfolding. The Baghdad Battery is one of those story of curiosity, of possibility, of forgotten hands, crafting something whose purpose we may never fully know. And that's all right, because in the gentle dark, as we trace its outlines with our minds, the battery becomes not a solution, but a companion, a little clay vessel, quietly reminding us that mystery is not the enemy of understanding it, is its beginning. So whether it powered rituals or coded coins, lit lamps or inspired legends, the Baghdad Battery continues to work its quiet magic, not through volts or currents, but through wonder. And tonight, as we drift softly into sleep, we carry that magic with us. Somewhere between what is known and what is imagined lies a veil soft boundary that separates knowledge from mystery. And through that veil, every so often, we glimpse something that doesn't quite fit. The Baghdad Battery is one such glimpse. But it is not alone. Across the landscape of ancient history, there are other objects that speak in the same quiet, questioning tone. Artifacts that suggest capabilities or understanding far ahead of their time, each one a thread in a tapestry of forgotten innovation. One of the most famous among these is the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in the waters off a Greek island in 1901. This corroded mass of bronze gears and fragments would eventually be recognized as an ancient analog computer built in the 2nd century BCE, capable of predicting astronomical positions and eclipses with astonishing precision. Its complexity was thought to be impossible for its era, and for decades its existence baffled scholars. Much like the Baghdad Battery, the Antikythera mechanism reminds us that history does not always unfold in neat, linear progressions. Technological knowledge can surge, flicker, and fade. Inventions can rise like candlelight in the dark, only to vanish before they illuminate the world. Other mysterious artifacts whisper the same possibility. There is the Dendera Lida carving on the wall of an Egyptian temple that, to some observers, resembles a bulb with a filament. Scholars generally interpret it as symbolic, tied to Egyptian mythology, but others wonder, could it be an artistic echo of a technological device, long forgotten? There are Roman dodecahedrons, small bronze objects with 12 flat faces and strange protrusions found across Europe. No one knows for certain what they were for scientific tools, candlestick holders, survey instruments. Each theory adds to the chorus of curiosity. And in China, ancient south-pointing chariots mechanical devices said to keep a figure pointing south regardless of direction suggest an understanding of gears and movement long before such concepts were common in the West. These artifacts, like the Baghdad Battery, exist at the edges of what we know. They challenge our timelines. They hum with unspoken stories. And while mainstream scholars rightly approach them with caution, their presence keeps a door open just wide enough for wonder. They also ask a deeper question. Why do we forget? Why would a civilization capable of creating a battery, a computer, or an automatic temple door not preserve and expand upon that knowledge? The answers are as complex as history itself. War, famine, conquest, fires that consumed libraries, transitions of power that erased traditions, or perhaps, most simply, shifts in purpose where a society no longer needed what it once revered. The Baghdad Battery may have belonged to a thread of innovation that was fragile, local, and deeply contextual. Perhaps it made sense only in a specific ritual setting, and once that context faded, so did the knowledge. Without a written tradition to preserve its use, its memory dissolved, leaving behind only the object, mute and strange. But perhaps the silence is not a loss. Perhaps it is a gift, because in these silences, we are invited to participate, to imagine, to feel the pull of the past, not just as something finished, but as something still becoming. The veil of ancient innovation isn't a wall, it's a curtain. And every time we wonder, every time we look closely, we draw it back just a little. And maybe that is the true purpose of these objects. Not to deliver answers, but to keep our questions alive. So we sit with the battery, with the gears, with the light-shaped carvings, not to solve them, but to honor the mystery they represent, the brilliance of forgotten minds, the fragile nature of knowledge, the beauty of curiosity itself. And in the stillness of night, that is enough. Beneath the stone pillars of ancient temples, where chants drifted upward like smoke and eyes turned skyward in reverence, the boundary between faith and function was beautifully blurred. To modern minds, shaped by category escience in one box, religion in another, this blending can be difficult to grasp. But for those who lived in Mesopotamia or Egypt or Persia thousands of years ago, belief and design were not separate. They were two threads of the same tapestry. In this light, the Baghdad Battery takes on a new kind of meaning. If it was used in templesses, some scholars have suggested it may not have been understood merely as a tool, but as an instrument of the divine. Its ability to tingle the skin or to coax gold onto metal might have been seen as a sacred transformation. A jar that could change the world around it, even subtly, would be a vessel of mystery and, therefore, a vessel of power. Ancient religions often involved more than prayer or worship. They were deeply experiential. Rituals engaged every sense. Colored pigments, burning oils, rhythmic drums, and smoke-filled spaces worked together to create awe. In such a setting, the effects of a device like the Baghdad Battery would not have been strange. They would have been appropriate. Imagine, for a moment, a darkened sanctuary. A priest anoints an amulet with oil, dips it into a copper basin, and after a silent moment, lifts it out shining with gold. To the witnesses, this is not chemistry. It is blessing. It is transmutation. The gods have touched the object. The vessel, the batteries, simply the bridge. Or consider another ritual. A devotee places their hands on a sacred symbol mounted within a jar. A mild current passes through them. A sensation spreads not, painful, but unfamiliar, surprising. To them, it is not electricity. It is the presence of something greater, a message, a cleansing. The materials themselves may have symbolized spiritual balance. Copper was associated with fertility, healing, and femininity. Iron with war, strength, and the male principle. The bitumen seal may have represented containment of opposing forces or protection from the unseen. The battery becomes a microcosm of the universe. Opposites brought into harmony, life animated by subtle forces. This is not so different from how sacred objects are viewed in many traditions, physical things imbued with invisible meaning. In Hindu rituals, for instance, statues are not just representations, but actual homes for divine presence once consecrated. In Christian traditions, relics of saints are believed to carry spiritual power. The battery, in this sense, could have been a container of sacred energy, whether understood through science or spirit. Even today, we see echoes of this merging. Think of how light is used in religious space candles, stained glass, oil lamps. Fire and illumination, once considered magical, remain at the center of spiritual life. Once, electricity would have been indistinguishable from miracle. And perhaps for ancient people, it was never meant to be separated. When we imagine ancient engineers as cold inventors and priests as separate visionaries, we miss something vital. that in many early cultures they were the same. The person who built the device may also have performed the rite. Knowledge was holistic. Function and meaning were one. This doesn't mean that the Baghdad Battery must have been used for religious purposes. We can't know for sure. But understanding the fusion of belief and utility helps us see why a device like this could exist and why its traces might be found not in workshops, but in tombs and temples. So when we hold the battery in our thoughts tonight, we don't need to choose between science and faith. Instead, we can honor the idea that once they worked hand in hand, that knowledge was wrapped in mystery, and mystery in knowledge. That invention was a kind of prayer, and every spark a silent hymn. And maybe, just maybe, the same spark still flickers in us. It sits in a glass case, now quiet, unassuming. Visitors to the museum might pass it without pause, its shape too ordinary, its surface too worn, just a jar. A little clay vessel stained by time, cracked gently at the rim. But if you linger, if you lean in, if you listen not with ears, but with attention, you might hear it breathe. It is the breath of time, of centuries, of all the hands that once touched it, all the minds that wondered over it. A whisper from a civilization long gone, speaking in the language of copper and clay. The Baghdad Battery, whether a forgotten invention or misunderstood artifact, has become something more than itself. It is now a silent witness to human ingenuity, to the fragility of memory, to the enduring echo of questions we may never answer. The people who built it are dust now, their voices lost to the winds of history. No scrolls remain to explain what they intended. No inscriptions declare its purpose. But that silence does not diminish its meaning. It deepens it. Because here is an object that reminds us how little we truly know. It invites us to imagine, to look at history, not as a closed book, but as a story still being told. Every chipped edge, every corroded rod, is a page not yet turned. And in that uncertainty, we are not disoriented. We are welcomed. Welcomed into the same wonder those long ago artisans may have felt when they first sealed the vessel and set it aside. Perhaps they never imagined it would survive, that it would cross centuries and languages and wars to rest in a museum half a world away. Perhaps they did not seek to be remembered. And yet they are, through this jar, this strange, beautiful puzzle. It has become more than a vessel. It is a symbol of the way humanity dreams, of how we touch the unknown not only with science, but with hope. It sits between what was and what might have been. A thing that was Madino explained, Preservedno understood, loved by some, doubted by others, and yet still here. As you drift toward sleep, let the image settle softly behind your eyes. A small room lit by oil light. Sand brushing stone outside the walls. A person sits cross-legged, hands steady, building something quietly. Copper, iron, clay, bitumen, a few drops of fermented wine. They seal it carefully, not knowing their hands are shaping a question that will echo for 2,000 years. They do not speak. They only press the jar closed and leave it for time. Now it is yours, to hold in thought, to wonder over, to love for what it is and what it might have been. And in the silence, the battery continues to work not with electricity, but with something gentler. Memory, imagination, a steady current of mystery that hums just beneath the surface of what we know. And now, dear listener, the story has been told. The clay jar rests again this time, not beneath desert sands, but within the quiet spaces of your thoughts. No longer just an object, but a gentle companion, a keeper of secrets. A reminder that mystery is not something to be solved in haste, but something to be lived with softly. As you close your eyes, let your breath slow, like dust settling over the ancient stones. Let the weight of time wrap around you, not heavy, but comforting. For even in all that is unknown, there is a peace, a stillness that echoes with the presence of those who came before us, who built, who believed, who wondered. Tonight, in your dreaming, you may find yourself in a distant temple, or walking among old ruins bathed in moonlight. Perhaps you will glimpse a flicker of gold on copper, or feel a tingling warmth in the palm of your hand. Whatever appears, let it come gently. For the past is never truly gone. It sleeps, it stirs, and sometimes, if we are quiet enough, it speaks. Thank you for sharing this quiet journey. Sleep well, rest deeply, and let the current of curiosity carry you softly into your dreams.